so moving on to volumetrics. So before we can get into doing some of the calculations, want to just briefly run through some of the definitions. So the volumetric reservoir analysis it is a very specific definition, and the assumption for a volumetric reservoir is that it's completely isolated, it's a closed system, and it has, the hydrocarbon pore volume is fairly constant. So there's no influx, there's no pressure sinks, and there's no pressure being applied outside of the system. You're dealing just with a sealed system. This is a pretty simple analysis method, and it's often performed kind of early on in the process of your discovery for your assets. You only need some fairly straightforward and readily available data. So you just need core samples, some logs and some geologic maps, and obviously with any other type of calculation methodology, the more information and the more data you have, the better. But this, you can at least start getting what I call back of the envelope numbers. You can get them at least a starting point fairly easily with just some baseline level assumptions. As I mentioned, usually done when your initial estimates of your hydrocarbons in place, maybe trying to justify an initial drilling program with some rough geologic information. And then sometimes the volumetric analysis can also be performed after the fact, maybe as a secondary recovery process. If you're going to go back and look at maybe putting a field in water injection or gas injection or something of that nature, volumetric analysis can come in handy with that, because again, it's pretty simple, and you just need a handful of pieces of information to be able to at least get a starting point. So the main assumptions for volumetric analysis is we don't have any water influx or condensation happening in the formation. We don't have any compaction or water expansion, and typically speaking, usually you use an average property used for the entire study area. So especially for the questions that you're going to see in the exam, they're the very simplistic, example types of problems that you may remember from any early reservoir engineering class, where you're given a perfectly round reservoir with a gas cap of X number of feet, and everything's nice and clean and easy. So the volumetric calculations are kind of our first starting point at getting into some of the deeper calculations in coming up with your reserve estimates and just overall hydrocarbons in place. Yeah, constant pressure from the outside, so we're not dealing with any kind of like reservoir dominated boundary flow conditions or anything like that. It's all assumed to be a fairly static system. It's real, it's definitely not complicated and in depth enough to really satisfy a lot of the kind of more intense types of reservoir recovery questions, and you'll kind of see, you'll get a flavor for the types of questions as we go on.